never hinted that he would not follow the constitutional plan for succession of power, it is doubly disturbing that their call for military insurrection is based on fanciful conjecture about what the president might or might not do under various scenarios. The idea of a military takeover has been percolating for some time. As early as August 18, 2020, Defense One had published an article by Thomas Crosby entitled 6 Scenarios for Military Intervention After January 20th. After discussing the rather implausible scenarios, its author stated, "Coups are nasty things, and discussing them in the American context is deeply distasteful. Nevertheless, facing those scenarios may help us understand the real dynamics general and flag officers will be forced to navigate in the coming months." The author appears to suggest that the generals must begin to contemplate overthrowing the president on or after January 20th, 2021, if the situation warrants doing so. Now, that lieutenant colonel's letter might be dismissed as delusional. However, other factors, including its prominent placement in Defense One, suggest that others are acting in concert to undermine the authority of the president as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The military, quite frankly, is becoming dangerously politicized. General James Mattis is the former Secretary of Defense who resigned in 2018 in a successful effort to block the president from withdrawing troops from Syria. On June 3rd, 2020, he issued a frightening denunciation of the president. After praising the rioters for their wholesome and unifying demands, he denounced the president in scathing terms. And he said, "We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership." He said, "We can unite without him," drawing on the strengths inherent in our civil society. During the week of June the 7th, 2020, retired General Colin Powell led other retired military leaders in blasting the commander-in-chief. Powell praised those officers who had spoken out against the president in recent days. General Powell echoed General Mattis's denunciations of the president, saying that he agreed that Trump is the first president in his lifetime who is not trying to unite the country. As an aside, I would point out that it was General Colin Powell who famously waved a test tube mimicking sarin gas, deceitfully urging the UN to support the invasion of Iraq. His guile and deception led to the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the killing of 2 million innocent people. In a veiled swipe at the American electorate, retired Marine General John Kelly said, "I think we need to look harder at who we elect." Retired Marine Corps General John Allen arrogantly claimed, "Donald Trump isn't religious. He has no need for religion and doesn't care about the devout, except insofar as they serve his political needs." The declarations of these military officials appear calculated to undermine the president's authority to quell domestic disturbances. By suggesting that invoking the Insurrection Act is illicit, and by downplaying widespread urban terror, these officials have placed their imprimatur on the violent criminal behavior. Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice prohibits retired officers from using contemptuous words against the President of the United States. It is difficult to justify legally many of these officers' comments. In some instances, the contemptuousness toward the President appears to violate criminal law. Taken together, the coordinated release of scathing remarks by senior officials, coupled with publication of a letter advocating a military coup, suggests a deep sickness within the Pentagon and within our constitutional structure. To my knowledge, neither the Secretary of Defense nor the service chiefs have taken action against the widely publicized talk of military insurrection. General Milley should refer the colonel's letter to the legal counsel for the Joint Chiefs to determine whether its publication violates the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Beyond that, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper has an obligation to issue a grave warning against officers, both active and retired, who seek to overthrow the President of the United States using armed force. Those retired officers who have published contemptuous words against the President of the United States should be issued permanent letters of reprimand cautioning against criminal violations of Article 88 UCMJ. They should be reminded that Article 88 applies to retired officers and that the law was enacted because undermining the authority of the Commander-in-Chief presents a clear and present danger to the survival of our republic. The Department of Defense must act resolutely to restore public confidence. Americans deserve assurance that our nation will not be overthrown by a military cabal.
Recent court decisions have revealed that the National Security Agency, one of the most secretive agencies in the world, in fact illegally spied on American citizens, as had been contended by Edward Snowden. And in a communication, a tweet that was published by Snowden a couple days ago, he said, 7 years ago, as the news declared I was being charged as a criminal for speaking the truth, I never imagined that I would live to see our courts condemn the NSA's activities as unlawful, and in the same ruling credit me for exposing them. And yet that day has arrived. Well, he's talking about 2013. But it was in 2001 that Snowden's ancestors attempted to do the same thing without having to resort to the means that Snowden felt he had to use. What you're about to hear will in part shock you. It will hopefully spur you into action. You're going to be hearing from two members of a team, which was called the Thin Thread Team. And they will describe who they are. We will first hear from Kirk Wiebe, and he will say a few things, which you'll hear, and then you'll be hearing from William Binney.
For most of my time at NSA from 1975 until we walked out of the building on Halloween Day 2001, I was involved in very interesting work. I used my language, a lot of it doing what we call transcription, which is rendering Russian speech into printed Russian or transliterated Russian for analysis by others. And then after putting a good stint in the transcription area, I did some staff work on Five Eyes partnerships, the Five Eyes meaning NSA, Canada, CSE, it's called GCHQ of the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and then Australia. Those are the Five Eyes that have a particularly close partnership on intelligence matters. And then after that bit of staff work, I went into data collection and data processing, managing those things for analysts that were studying the Soviet Union. And that opened a whole lot of other channels in terms of experience, collection of data, different types of collection, different types of data, and all the processing requirements to go through the technical capabilities against various kinds of signals. And then I actually was selected to move into analysis and headed up a top priority requirement that came down from President Reagan called National Security Decision Directive number 178, which had to do with strategic relocatable targets, which is really a technology that you use to confuse targeting efforts by an enemy. In other words, rather than having stationary headquarters, you put your headquarters in mobile kinds of vehicles and things of that nature, maybe on a train, maybe on a plane. And so the whole issue of strategic relocatable targets, including missiles put on trains and vehicles, was the subject that I eventually got awarded the second highest award that NSA confers, the Meritorious Civilian Service Award. Also received the Director of Central Intelligence's Meritorious Unit Award, recognizing my whole branch at NSA of about 70 people for their work on that topic. And after that, I went into some other types of staff functions associated with higher management. And it was about that time that Bill Binney bent my ear and said, why don't you come down to our little research center? And that's where I knew who Bill was, but I didn't know what he was doing at the time. So I went down and saw what they were doing. And to me, it was NSA's future, because they were dealing no longer with channel switch networks, radio frequency based networks, but packet switched networks. In other words, the internet, TCP/IP. And what did that mean for NSA's future in terms of a source of information, its breadth, what were the implications technologically, and so forth. So my last assignment was working with Bill on that particular vexing problem. I say vexing because the three issues with the internet are velocity of data. It's fast. It runs along a wire, speed of light. The variety of data, a lot of different types of applications and uses. And the volume, huge volume, especially as the internet grew globally. And I'd hate to estimate, but there's probably 60 terabytes generated every minute in terms of global data. So anyway, that was really fun, but our solution that we developed, that a lot of people have heard of, is called ThinThread, flew in the face of NSA's intentions to get a big budget from Congress and spend big dollars on the military-industrial complex. And it's a problem that we solve for, a few $100,000 or at least no more than $1 million or $2 million. And NSA wanted a $4 billion budget to solve the problem. So our little solution was squashed in favor of big project mode that failed 5 years later under the Director's Trailblazer program. At that point, Bill and I and Ed Loomis walked out of the building on October, right after 9/11, because we were heartbroken that our little solution that was very effective and efficient had not been put into the fight against terror. And we saw the result. Am I 100% sure Thin Thread would have prevented 9/11? Yeah, I am. We knew what to target. We knew where the sources were, what we needed to target. And to be honest with you, if you ask Tom Drake, another one of the NSA whistleblowers that came later, he'll tell you that after we left, he found 9/11 information in NSA's database that predicted the event. He also told us that an analyst at NSA, a group, not just one, but a small team, already knew that 9/11 was going to happen and was going to put out a report, but was prevented from doing so by the director of NSA, Michael V. Hayden. I wish I could tell you why. I have lots of guesses, but that's a topic for another day. Thin Thread began in a small research organization of about 12 people as an experiment. Whenever you have a technical problem to solve, you get some good people together and you talk about ways to try to attack it, and you have a bunch of failures, and then you begin to succeed in small steps. And so we advanced our understanding of how to go after the internet as a source of intelligence. And like I said, there were three main issues we had to solve. There's the velocity. This stuff's moving along a wire at real time. And there's a lot of variety in it. There's some text, there's some speech, there's some video, there's some this and that, and different layers of the internet involved, the 7 OSI layers. Which one of those layers is important for Intel? Which ones aren't so much? Especially when you have small dollars and you're trying to make a research breakthrough, where you're going to put those dollars against what in the internet? And then the volume of data is horrendous. So it's like trying to sip from a fire hose. How do you extract data intelligently and not inundate your database? So I think what they did in the SIGINT Automated Research Center, SARC, we called it, was absolutely amazing. Thin Thread was essentially a method of extracting data from the internet in real time, or near real time. There was a slight buffering, and sort it. We couldn't collect communications of U.S. sources from U.S. persons, and so we had to understand the addressing system, the IP allocations, in order to build a filter that would shunt any data that was not to be surveilled because of the law and the rights of Americans under the Constitution, but allow other things that were fair game. In other words, all other communications other than U.S., all foreign communications, because that's NSA's charter, foreign intelligence. And then, having collected this data, that's not enough. So now you got a bunch of data. You have to sort through it, organize it, and connect the dots where you can, so that the greater picture is understood. And so the name Thin Thread is a little bit of a misnomer. And if you talk to the developer of Thin Thread, Ed Loomis, he'll tell you it's a direct misnomer. But because the press have picked up on this name, Bill and others have felt rather than go through the long explanation of how ThinThread is different from the analytic back end, and there are other names for those programs that Bill developed, he just decided to settle on ThinThread because it was in the public and it wouldn't lead him down a potentially sensitive path where systems are still in use and you don't want the names of them in the public domain. So ThinThread is technically just the data grabber, if you will, and the data sorter in terms of what's legal and what's not, and the dictionary lookup, looking for topics in emails and or attachments that hit a list of keywords reflecting interests of analytics, interesting topics. And then putting those filters against this data stream to cull out the stuff worth looking at, and then putting those communications in a connect the dots system so that if Jose is talking to Dennis, you'll see the link between their two emails or their two phone calls or whatever it may be. You need to link things up so that you can understand an activity and see who's involved in it at any given moment in time. So that gives you a little bit of the flavor of ThinThread. And it was the initial breakthrough, though, in the ability to take a large chunk, a fairly large, a reasonably large section of the internet and exploit it.
Guccifer 2 data that we looked at, we clearly showed the speeds of the downloads of that data to a thumb drive were possible, but it was not possible to send that data across the internet to Russia or anywhere else outside the United States, basically, or even inside the United States. There were a lot of places couldn't get it because they don't have these high-speed lines to carry that kind of rate transfer. So, and we proved that. Not only did we show that the speeds that were involved, but we also showed that you couldn't do it. We tried to do our transfer from Albania, from Netherlands, from the UK, and the further east we got, the less speed we got. The lower speeds, we couldn't achieve the higher speeds going further east. It went down. So, but after that, also we looked at the data that Guccifer 2 published, both on the 15th of June, the 5th of July, and the 1st of September. The two files he published on the 1st of September and the 5th of July of 2016, if you look at them and only looked at minutes, seconds, and milliseconds, you could shuffle them together like a deck of cards without conflict. That says the guy is playing a game with the data. That he did one download, split it into two files, did a range change on the date and a range change on the hour, because he couldn't do it on the minutes because it crossed many minutes. And he couldn't do it on the seconds or milliseconds because there's many of those. So he could only do a range change on the date and the hour, which is apparently what he did because those two files merge into one. That said to us that he was playing with the data. And then on the 15th of June, he published articles, some articles showing that had Russian fingerprints in it. Well, our affiliates doing the research with us in the UK looked at that data and found that five of those files, they also found in the Podesta email documentation by WikiLeaks that was posted on, I think, the 21st of September. That was at least the times that they had it. So the point was those files that were in the WikiLeaks publication didn't have any Russian fingerprints. So that meant Guccifer 2 inserted those fingerprints. And then we went back to the Vault 7 material where the Vault 7 material said this program Marble Framework, which was a program that made it look like other countries did the hack when in fact the CIA did the hack. Well, they were able to mimic or make it look like the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, or Arabs did the attack, so that they could attack anybody and leave fingerprints, making it look like someone else did it. So when you looked at it, that meant to us that Guccifer 2 was using some kind of program or some process to insert that fingerprints into the data from the DNC. Now, in top of that, in the Vault 7 material, it said there that the Marble Framework program was used one time in 2016. Well, we think we found it. And that says to us all the evidence that we've been accumulating forensically from the outside is pointing back at CIA as the origin of Guccifer 2. So their entire allegation about you and the Russians and everybody has a false premise to start with, so that everything that they introduced, or the reason they went after you and also General Flynn, was what I think lawyers call fruit of the poison tree. They set it up, they manipulated it, they contrived it, and they executed it. And you and General Flynn and they tried to make us also, put us in jail under the Espionage Act by fabricating evidence against us too. So, it's really, how can we ever trust the FBI until Barr and Durham really clean it up?
We Americans should be really concerned about the bulk acquisition of data by NSA and the Five Eyes and other countries around the world, because what it's doing is capturing everything that everybody's doing electronically in the world and tracking you wherever you are as you move around day by day, minute by minute, which means that they can retroactively analyze anything that you've done in the past at least 19 years. And this has been done before, and it's used against people to stop them from doing some things the government doesn't want. Like, for example, when Eliot Spitzer went against the bankers on Wall Street, trying to take them to court for defrauding people in the 2007-2008 financial crisis. They used that data to find something against him, to leverage him and get rid of him. So the point is that this data, when given to governments or people in general, sooner or later, the power they have, they use, and they use it against you. And there are ways to fix this. And the way to do it is to force them into doing a focused, disciplined, targeted approach, just like the police do when they're investigating a crime. Here, all they have to do is use the logic, deductive, inductive, and abductive logic, to look at people who are associated with or known to be bad people for whatever reason, criminal activity, or leaders of countries, or governments, or militaries, things of that nature, and focus on them and that 1 degree from them as the basis for that for the investigation of content as well as metadata. But then you need to look beyond that, the next degree. As long as you don't go through a company or a government agency, which would expand you into collecting massive numbers of people who aren't relevant to anything. And by doing this, what it will do is basically this approach would have found virtually all of the terrorist attacks and all of the criminal activity in before 9/11, for 9/11, and after 9/11. Still, it would work. And the problem now is they have so much data, and they're using dictionary select as a way of doing it, word searches, phrase searches, things like that. And when you go through the massive amounts of data they're collecting, it gets a ton of material dumped on people, and they can't see the threats coming, and they're dysfunctional at that point. So the attacks happen, people die, and then they clean up the mess afterwards, and then go in and look. Once they know who did it, they can look at all the data they've compiled on it. That's a forensics job. That's not an intelligence job. So the idea is, if you do that, and you also do things like inductive logic, where you're looking at people where they're visiting sites in the web. Are they looking at sites that advocate pedophilia, violence against the West, any kind of criminal activity? Then that's an indication that they are in what I call the zone of suspicion, and that's what people need to investigate to see if they are also involved. If they are, then they can develop information to justify a warrant based on probable cause behavior in the communities that they're involved, and you can solve this. And this would give privacy to everybody in the United States and around the world, and also create a rich environment for intelligence analysts and the police to look at, to solve problems and prevent attacks. So it's solvable. We can do that. All we have to do is force our government to abide by our Constitution and make them do a focused, disciplined, professional job.
We're now going to bring our panelists back up for discussion. We're going right back now to our question and answer period. We don't have absolutely everybody who was on before, but with us now are Jim Jatras, Kirk Wiebe, Bill Binney, Martin Sieff, and of course Helga Sepp-LaRouche. Is Colonel Black there? Yes. He is there. Okay, fine. I don't see him on my screen. And of course, Diane Sayers there as well. I'll only indicate for people who might have tuned in the middle of this or whatever. Clearly, the international implications of even discussing militarily removing the President of the United States, one wishes not to really have to ponder too long, but you have to ask a question about that. And so I'll just leave it at that, hanging in the air. And I guess I'll ask first because, as we did before, some of our panelists may have a response to what they've just seen. So I think I'll start with Martin Sieff. He got a little short shrift of that earlier. So, Martin, if you have something you'd like to say, any comment?
Thank you very much. I think what we've heard from the latest speakers, especially from Colonel Black, is extremely alarming, must be taken most seriously. There is a very alarming historical precedent that immediately leaps to mind to me, and that is the steps that were taken under President James Buchanan in 1860 to his everlasting shame that expedited the secession of the southern states and the beginning of the Civil War. On that occasion, too, there is a parallel with now we saw the open attempts to influence and seduce serving senior officers of the United States Army and to follow secessionist states and the eventual Confederacy, and large numbers of them did so. And the result was a national catastrophe. And I do think that the alarming scenario that Colonel Black in particular has documented needs to be understood in similar terms. But the media sits on it. There appears to be no way through the conventional media to alert the American people to this imminent danger. And I think it must be taken most seriously.
Thank you. Mr. Jatras, do you have anything you'd like to say at this point? I think you're muted. Yes.
Yes, we hear more and more of various scenarios that may ensue in November, none of which look particularly appetizing. But one is something along the lines of what we saw in the last congressional election, particularly in California, in Orange County, where a number of wins were scored for the Republicans on election night, and then in subsequent days and weeks flipped over to the Democratic camp because of absentee and late voting and all these other things that we're seeing more and more of, especially with mail-in voting justified supposedly by the virus. I think there's a very real danger that we could get to a situation on November 3rd where we think possibly we have a winner, possibly it's Trump, but then it turns out not to be. And we have something like the year 2000 on steroids, where we really don't have any idea who the real winner is, and possibly even competing inauguration. That's when I think we have a real danger of the kind of unconstitutionality to remove Trump because there is this ambiguous circumstance that has been created, perhaps deliberately created, in order to facilitate that. It should be of great alarm to me, to everybody, I think, that so much of the resistance to Trump has been generated from inside the bowels of the bureaucracy and the establishment itself, including the military establishment, the so-called steady state, as even its partisans like to describe it. And let's remember, in line with our earlier discussion today, this is the very establishment that wants to keep pursuing these very confrontational policies with Russia and China, and to avoid doing the constructive things all of us have been advocating in this discussion. So I think we're facing a real possibility of a showdown of some sort in the fall.
Helga, I'd like to ask if you have both something to say or any questions for anybody on the panel at this point.
Well, I think that the danger of a constitutional crisis come early November is clearly there, also in light of Hillary Clinton saying that Biden should under no circumstances concede. Nancy Pelosi, I think, said similar things. Biden himself also. So, the danger around the ballot controversy, it's clearly there. So if you think what can be possibly done to unrail something which could, really get us into a incredible danger, where what Senator Black said, is it needs to be not excluded. It seems to me that apart from what we were discussing earlier in terms of the P5 changing the dynamic in terms of replacing the geopolitical confrontation with a win-win cooperation, at least as a declaration of intent. The other second major thing which I think could be done to change this present course of action would be if Attorney General Barr would finally publish the result of the different investigations, including the Durham investigation. I think the big elephant in the room is the fact that it was British intelligence, including former head of MI6, Sir Dearlove, Richard Dearlove, the Christopher Steele story, the whole collusion of parts of the intelligence apparatus in the United States with the British intelligence involved in a coup attempt against President Trump, that if that would be published before the election, I think, that would really, clear the way and reestablish, the United States as a republic. So my question is, to the other panelists, what do you think from your area of expertise, what can be done to further that, to get Barr to publish these things, because I think that would really put the cat among the mice.
Well, are you able to hear me now?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Yes, we are.
I'm not sure that I'm prepared to exactly answer Helga's question, but let me say, here's what's unfolding right now. The military has taken a very concerted view that they're diminishing the president's ability to use the Insurrection Act to maintain order. They're also preparing for a possible military coup and to take action and physically to remove the president if they dislike the way that things occur after January 20th. Now, what gets to be problematic is that a number of Democrat states have instituted this mail-in voting. The problem with mail-in voting is it has a long, storied history of misuse and failure and fraud. Back when Lyndon Johnson was first running for U.S. Senate, he had lost the race, and then a couple of weeks went by, and suddenly from one of his areas, they emerged with something that was called Magic Box 13. Back then, all of the ballots were handwritten, and when the Republicans went to federal court, the judge looked at it. He saw that every single ballot was written in the same handwriting using the same pens. It was obviously illegitimate. He threw them all out. The Democrats then went to Abe Fortas on the Supreme Court, who was friendly to their cause. he blocked the whole thing. And as a consequence, Lyndon Johnson became the senator from Texas and eventually rose on to cause tremendous bloodshed in Vietnam and so forth. So there is a long history of voter fraud. We know what happened with the JFK versus Nixon election, the first election, how Mayor Daley came in. He brought in a bunch of fake votes that tipped the election. So this is not a new thing. And what I envisioned happening is that Trump might very well win a very sweeping victory on November 3rd. But Hillary Clinton is saying, don't accept that. Don't concede, because we could take these ballots that are being distributed by the tens of thousands, and we can create as many votes as you need to win. I don't know what we do. I mean, this is extraordinarily dangerous. It's never happened before. It will be, an example of clear fraud that I think should be fairly obvious to the public. It's going to be a dangerous time that we're going to pass through. And I think it's just important that the people be informed of what's about to happen. And the fact that it is being backed up by potential military force and the ability to implement a violent coup if necessary, I should say maybe not violent, a forceful coup, is potentially a very genuine threat to the future of the constitutional experiment and the Republic of the United States.
All right. Any follow-up? Yeah, Kirk, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, we have to replace the existing system. I don't mean in terms of government process. I'm talking about the terrible state of the election software, hardware, and the voting machines, the way the systems count votes, the way they report votes. That whole process from voter registration and cleanup and validation of those who have the legal right to vote, right on through the tallying and the reporting. It's a mess. It's a mess because it's not under the purview of the federal government to fix all that. The Constitution was written to keep the power of voting within the 50 state or various states. So we have 50 secretaries of state responsible for the election processes within their state. How do you get 50 people together in a room, or the representatives, and say, let's reinvent the voting process to provide security, validation of those voting, and the count? And let's not stick it on the internet in a stupid way where people can play with it, hack into it, and so forth and so on. Bill and I sent letters to 50 secretaries, all 50, about a month ago, saying we can help you fix your voting process. We didn't get one response. Not one. In fact, I would tell you, Bill and I have been thinking for over a year and a half on ways to improve, not the whole system, because even with a year and a half's notice, there's a lot of work to be done across 50 states. But there are a few prudent things we could have done. We could have helped a few key states, battleground states, verify their registration rolls using database comparisons and straighten that out. But we could find no one willing to fund or take on this project. And we found no way to communicate with anyone at the federal level who might help grease the skids politically and or financially. We know the Senate threw money at the states. I think recently 200 million. Now that's not a lot of money, but it should be a good a good amount to do something effective. It didn't do anything for 2020. So we got a problem, Houston. It begins in the 50 states, and we need a willing, well-intentioned group of people to get into a room and do what most people do. Figure it out and move forward, or we're going to be right back in this problem in 2024.
Yes. Bill, you seem to be animated. Did you like to say something?
No, I just agree with everything that Kirk said. I was very disappointed in the lack of response on our proposal to the secretaries of states of all the 50 states. It just says that whatever they're doing, they don't appear to be serious about it. I mean, they seem to be in a hodgepodge. I mean, it's hard to understand how anybody, unless you control the devices or the software running on the devices, it's hard to understand how anybody could influence the election other than, being able to act through those through that hardware or the software. In other words, there's some implants in it to make the outcome a certain way. Other than that, I don't see anybody being able to hack anything in the election in our country.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Because there's 50 different versions, and they're all doing different things slightly.
All right. So, all right. I think I got everybody. So Diane, I think you've got some questions.
Yes. Can I be heard?
We can hear you.
Yes.
All right. So this one comes in from New York. The person writes, given that over the past 30 years, it has become blatantly obvious that any time regime change in the form of colored revolution, the modern form of Western hybrid warfare or otherwise, is undertaken to remove a sovereign leader of a country anywhere on the globe under the guise of democracy, the legitimate leader is invariably replaced by an Anglo-neoliberal proxy who invariably leads the country into increased poverty, drug dependence, a total destruction of any real existing physical economy, and complete pessimism, cynicism, and increased death, demoralization, and destruction of the population. Given this outcome, which has been borne out dozens of times in the preceding decades, and especially since 1995, I have the following questions. A, how exactly is a color revolution organized in a targeted country? B, what factors mark a targeted country for regime change by this Anglo-British axis? C, given the resulting and intended destruction and enslavement of nations through these means, how is it not obvious to everyone on the globe as to these warfare tactics being deployed, and how does a nation best fight back? This is extremely relevant to what we are seeing unfold in Belarus in the present and the actions long attempted versus Russia and China. And I myself would add also in the United States right now.
So who's the question for, Diane? Yeah.
He says anyone on the panel who cares to answer it.
Okay. All right, Jack just has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll give it a stab to start with. I mean, I think the methodology is well set out in Gene Sharp's book. I can't remember the exact title, but it has all of the mechanisms involved in terms of mobilizing people on the street, making it look as though it's the police that are responding with violence rather than the so-called protesters. You create a narrative which is then picked up seamlessly by all the world media and by the governments that are behind the regime change plan. And of course, there will always be local abuses. There'll be things wrong in these societies that are used as pretexts and slogans in order to justify the regime change. You add to that the kind of threats that would be used against the target government that are going to be held responsible for various crimes. There will be sanctions imposed on the country. So there is a methodology to this, which, as the questioner points out, is well known. And it tends to work very well. How does the country protect themselves from that? To start with, get all these NGOs. If you're a foreign country, I'm not talking about here in the United States, get all these NGOs out of your country. At least the Russians have done that. I don't think the Chinese allow that because these are simply breeding mechanisms for the eventual regime change operation.
Okay, I just wanted to indicate, I see we're getting questions in for various individuals, which I guess is good. I think the way we should probably proceed is I'll indicate those, but if someone else on the panel has a response, just put up your hand so I know you're eager to respond to this. This question is for Martin Seif. This is from Gerald from Oakland, California. I know Gerald, as do many of us. And he's asking a question, which is a general one, but it's directed, I think, particularly to you. He says,
sure.
The reason can you discuss the Sir Kim Darroch affair? This is the British ambassador that got called to the United States, who got called back. The reason I think this is important is that while many think that the British are also rans who have no say in things anymore, Sir Kim Darroch and others did not agree with that. They actively sought to control President Trump and the United States by, quote, flooding the zone. That's this term that Darroch used. Yeah. Through media and personal influences over President Trump. Darroch was directly involved in the attempt of a regime change against the nation that was hosting him as an ambassador. Finally, even though he was unceremoniously booted out of the U.S., he got a raise back home and was made a member of the British House of Lords. Today, he is being interviewed in the British press attacking Boris Johnson and Trump, showing that he has not a whiff of shame about what he did. In fact, he's still at it. So why do you downplay the British establishment role in the world?
I don't deny the British establishment role in the world. I am, after all, Irish. Having said that, I have been in Washington for 33 years, and your friend in Oakland has not. And what I have repeatedly seen during that period of time, as I said before, is the British are eager to get on board. There are certainly, and the City of London is an enthusiastic part of this neoliberal global consensus. The British people have suffered as much as the American people have from the catastrophic results of unlimited free trade and unregulated borders. They're equal victims in this. But when one looks at the British establishment, you do not see the American establishment eager to ape the British establishment. You do see the British political establishment, and I still see it to this day, and it is an increasing process. Margaret Thatcher was often independent of President Reagan, though they treated each other with great respect. She was the one who told Reagan, and I had access to the people who were privy to this information at the time, that Gorbachev was, quote, a man we could do business with to conduct arms control treaties and end states of tension in the Cold War. She was also very angry at Reagan and showed it openly when Reagan invaded Grenada. The British had consternation when one of Reagan's most influential cabinet members and a close influence on him, the late Jeane Kirkpatrick, supported Argentina against Britain in the Falklands War. So the relationship between Britain and the United States, A, is not seamless, and B, existentially, the British establishment and policymakers feel vastly more dependent on the United States than is the case the other way around. What I will add to this is the British establishment, and clearly this it's now revealed the intelligence establishment very much so, expected Clinton to win, was totally on board with the American deep state in 2016, would be totally on board here. But clearly we see Prime Minister Boris Johnson is not totally on board with them and is not regarded as fully trustworthy by them. So we have a subtle, complex picture here, but the role of the British establishment as players in this is very clear. And the one point I will add here is they're often at a tactical level criminally incompetent, which I suppose in some respects is a sign of encouragement. Because if you look at the Steele dossier, which was used so loudly and for so long as a supposed threat to discredit President Trump, it's childish. It's infantile. A 12-year-old child could not put together a more unconvincing or amateurish piece of work. And yet Steele, who put it together, was the head of the Russia section of the British Intelligence Service, a position of enormous sensitivity and responsibility, for at least 6 years. This is the kind of people they have running things. In a sense, there is hope, if you see what I mean, because incompetence creates vulnerabilities. So I do not look upon the British establishment as godlike, and I do not look upon them as telling the American establishment from a position of Olympian superiority what to do. That is simply not what we have systematically seen and observed and continue to see. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So would anyone like to say anything about that? Well, okay, we got Helga. We're going to go ladies first, and then we'll go to Colonel Black. Okay, you go ahead.
Well, I think that the problem of who wags the tail and who is the dog, I think that if you look at the long history of British imperial history in Africa, in the Middle East, in India, against China, there is no question that the British have a vast experience which they bring into play all the time. And if you look at where do certain campaigns originate, like, for example, the campaign against China being responsible for the spread of the virus, it clearly comes from the former heads of MI6, Dearlove and Thorsten, both being former heads of the MI6. And I think that apart from that, you can trace down where certain operations started, which in many times was with the British, including the white helmet operations, the false flag operations, getting President Trump to, even send a attack in the middle of the summit with President Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago. I mean, all of these things, come really from British origin. But apart from that, I think the thing to also consider is that the real British role is not just that it starts in Great Britain, but that the coup which was accomplished is that to win the American establishment over to go with the British Empire as a model. I think that is really the way to look at it. So when we say British, it is not necessarily always the physical British, it is a concept. The British Empire is not the British people. I agree. The British subjects are, very poor. They have terrible food. They eat blood pudding and similar things. It's really the, the method. It's the empire. It's the control of the financial system. The model of the central banks, the investment banks, the hedge funds, the insurance companies controlling the financial system. That is the British model as compared to the Hamiltonian American model. So I think we should really look at the British question as a concept, and whoever has sold out their soul to it is part of it.
Okay, I think we're going to go to Diane, but Colonel Black, you had your hand up? Did you?
Yes, I did. I kind of wanted to go back just a little bit to the question about these color revolutions and how they are executed. The color revolutions typically will begin, there'll be a planning process that precedes them, but then afterwards, there's often pressure to release various terrorists, very dangerous elements in the prisons, as kind of a show of goodwill. We saw this in Libya, where Gaddafi's government was asked to do a show of good faith. They released a number of Muslim Brotherhood terrorists in Benghazi. And then, of course, the CIA uses that to put together an uprising. And once the uprising begins and civil servants are being killed and so forth, then snipers are used to begin to fire. First, they'll kill a protester, then they'll kill a police officer, back and forth. Before long, both sides think that the other one is shooting at one another. And at that point, the media, the worldwide media, loads on and says that the legitimate government is out of control. They're causing all of this violence, and eventually they bring pressure. We in Libya, for example, we When finally the time came that the central government said, okay, we're going to send a fairly modest military force, we're going to crack down, we're going to stop the execution of civil servants, then you had people within the Senate. John McCain was one of them. You had John Kerry on the other hand, and they were saying, okay, we've got to go in, we've got to stop this. We'll do a no-fly zone. And under the pretext of that, they commenced a massive bombing that destroyed hospitals, government centers, transportation networks, water centers, electrical power generation, destroyed everything. And at that point, they managed to raise up an army that eventually overthrew the country. We see this same general scenario used over and over again, where you start, there's always discontent in every country. There's discontent here, in Britain, everywhere you can name. But you start with those, you add to them these criminal elements that can be used as your street army, and then by funneling money through the CIA and other some of these billionaires who are interested, and they fund them, and it grows from there. So the color revolution has been used as a model repeatedly, and the fear is, and the concern is, that a color revolution may be coming here to the United States. This is something that I am very deeply concerned about as a retired officer myself.
Okay, very good. We have about 20 minutes left in our discussion, and I'm going to go to Diane for a minute, see if she's got a question. So, Diane?
Okay, yes, there's several. Mr. Kortunov raised the importance of U.S.-Russian collaboration regarding nuclear terrorism. We know the Russians sent information to the United States before the Boston bomber, and the Russians recently thanked the U.S. for intelligence regarding, I think that was around New Year, potential attacks in Russia. However, Secretary of Defense William Perry, in his William J. Perry project, raised the danger of nuclear terrorism in the midst of social chaos. Dr. Perry's project produced a film called Bill Perry's Nuclear Nightmare. Do you think the current chaos in cities in the United States and the call to take down the police, who tend to be the first line of defense against terrorism, might create conditions for such attacks? And again, several people have asked the question about what can be done about this by people in the targeted nations, and I think otherwise.
Anyone in particular?
No. Respond, or maybe a few responses.
Yeah. Would anybody like to take it?
Well, for one thing, people have got to come out in support of the police. If you want to know what to do, put up a sign in the back of your car that says, stop the looting, stop the arson, stop the murders, support your local police, or something like that. I mean, just to give you a very concrete example of something that an ordinary citizen can do, and then drive out in the morning traffic with it. You'll get some honks of agreement. You'll get some people flipping you the bird, but you're going to survive. Nobody's going to kill you unless you happen to be going through Chicago or some of these other violent places. But take action. I run into people who are afraid. I mean, really good people, and they're afraid to do something. And we're not to the point yet where you have to be seriously afraid that something is going to happen unless you're caught up in one of these BLM, Antifa, revolutionary lootings and burnings. Most people can drive a car out in the traffic, and it gets people's attention. If you put something in the back of your window that says, I'm against all of this urban violence. People take note. They say, oh, you know, people are really starting to think about this. I'm just giving you one very practical example, but really, you know, political movements result when individuals think of something they can do. Maybe they can send out a mass email. Maybe they can, who knows? But it's kind of a free, politics is a free market type of thing. You think of something you can do, you go out and you take action. And between now and November, we better start doing a lot of individual actions and making things happen on our own.
I think what I'm going to do, Helga, you want to say something? Go ahead.
I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly. Was the question if the danger is of nuclear terrorism in the context of these riots? Was that the question?
Yes.
Well, I mean, that is a very difficult question to answer because, you know, obviously the whole issue of non-proliferation is, you know, very crucial, and therefore the policies, you know, the JCPOA is being supported still by practically everybody except the United States and the Dominican Republic, because the worry is that if it's canceled, then Iran has no incentive to go back to building nuclear weapons. And the same thing, in a certain sense, is true for North Korea. And you heard what Dr. Kortunov said. This is all the more important why the United States, Russia, China must cooperate on the real dangers, which is terrorism, nuclear terrorism being just one aspect of it. And that is why, you know, the military doctrines are really questionable in putting Russia and China as the biggest threat, when it is those countries with whom there should be collaboration on all kinds of threats, terrorism, the drug epidemic, and, you know, anything which is of that sort. So I think that the collaboration of these major countries on these issues is what needs to be put on the agenda all the more urgently.
Okay, I think what I'm going to do, I see, Kirk, you have your hand up, but please let me do the following. I'm going to assign, since we're up on time, we've got about 11 minutes left, and everybody is certainly going to be able to answer, rather to have a final statement. But there's several questions. I'm going to have you all, various people, think about these, because everybody's got questions directed to them. For example, Colonel Black, we have a question which says, I think the information you provided against the prohibition in Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice of even retired military officers from undermining the authority of the president may come as a surprise to many, myself included. Historically, has it often been necessary to prosecute under those code provisions, or are we facing an unprecedented situation? What other tools, legal and otherwise, do we have in stopping a possible military coup? So that's the question for Colonel Black. Helga has a few. I'm going to wait for those. There's a question that's directed, I think, both to Mr. Jatras and Mr. Seif. Could any of the panelists say something about the recent Serbia-Kosovo agreements in coordination with President Trump as a template for future cooperation among other countries, emphasizing economic development to resolve problems? Okay, that's the basic question there. Mr. Binney has several. Let me see if I can get them. One was on my phone, excuse me. Somebody couldn't get through. Okay, Operation Mockingbird was a program of the CIA that began in the early years of the Cold War and attempted to manipulate news media for propaganda purposes. What role do intelligence services play in today's so-called mainstream media? Okay, that was the one that we have there. Just sort of trying to go, and I guess I'll come now to Helga, and if I've missed anybody, let me know. All right, so there's several here for you, Helga. This was a question from Germany. how can one manage to better educate? Well, this is actually for everybody. How can one manage to better educate the United States population about the condition in their own country? I think we're doing a fairly good job about that right now. Also about the election manipulation. So actually, we've actually been covering this question. There's a question from Virginia for Helga. Well, it was originally for Dr. Lazansky, who's not with us. But do you have any thoughts respecting how we might approach fuller realization of Mrs. LaRouche's proposal for cultural elevation and exchange as a crucial aspect of turning our nations from the course of confrontation to a partnership in reaching for the stars? All right. And this is also for Colonel Black. This is related to the other question, which is how does the Insurrection Act classify domestic terrorism, and how does the Uniform Code of Military Justice shape the response of U.S. Officer Corps? I think I've covered all the ones I have. Is there anybody on the panel I've missed? Yeah, Kirk. Yeah, actually, sorry about that. But you also have your hand up anyway, so you already have in mind what you're going to say. So I'm not going to worry about you. This is something I want to make sure we ask, though, and Helga, you would have something on this, I think, because this question came in early and I've missed it, which is from Venezuela. I'm greeting you from Venezuela. Congratulations for your excellent participation in this very important conference. As you know, we are under a terrible economic sanction attack by the U.S. government, so I wonder what we can do to avoid these economic sanctions and break the chains to set free, as we want to be solving our own problems by ourselves. That's all we want, is respect for our nation and political decisions. What do you think we can do for success in this global economy? So having now done that, Kirk, I'm going to start with you, and we'll go from there.
Okay, my response deals with the issue of rogue nuclear weapons under the umbrella of terrorist activity. And my comment was this. This issue, with the imminent demise of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of concern here in the U.S. And amongst the Department of Defense, of which both Bill and I were a part of at the time, about the disposition of Soviet nuclear weapons and what would happen under the autonomous rule of the various republics making up the Soviet Union. And so it was a lot of concern. And my thought is this. If there's anything any government keeps good track of, it's what it owns and possesses in terms of nuclear weapons. So the accounting for them is probably amongst the best of anything they do, probably better than counting their own population, precisely because of the danger nuclear weapons pose. And our concern was, well, what about the breakup of the Soviet Union? What's going to happen? I don't have a good feel for what really happened, but my sense is there was a pretty good accounting between us and the Russians on the disposition of nuclear weapons. So my sense is any nuclear weapon in rogue hands is worrisome, but I don't think that issue's widespread in terms of the greater picture.
Okay, very good. Let me also clarify, I didn't mean that when various people speak, you can't say anything else. It's just that we're up on time and we want to make sure we combine effects here. So, Mr. Jatras, how about we go to you?
Yes, very briefly, this little deal with Serbia and Kosovo is not a template for anything. This is just a brainchild of Richard Grenell, the outgoing ambassador from Germany to Germany, who simply was looking for kind of a poor man's Camp David photo op for Trump to say, oh, look, here's this great diplomatic achievement. This really doesn't amount to anything except further kicking the can down the road on what the status is of this pseudo-state Kosovo that was established by, let's be honest, NATO aggression in 1999. What the future brings is not going to be changed very much by this this agreement one way or the other. It's another little feather in the cap of Israel to have two more embassies, one of which doesn't actually represent a country, moved to Jerusalem. Other than that, it's meaningless.
Okay. Mr. Seif?
I'd differ from Jim on important marginal aspects on this and fully agree with him on all the key points. It's a vanity move to make the administration look good. From what I can tell, and I've been looking at it quite closely, none of the U.S. officials who are pushing this have any real knowledge of the region whatsoever, of its history, of its culture. Many of them are probably even totally ignorant of the NATO bombing campaign that artificially created Kosovo in the first place. Even the Prime Minister and the President of Kosovo and Serbia were pretty much at daggers drawn through the whole. It's a farce. It's an amusing farce if you look at it closely, but it cannot be taken, as Jim said, to be a template for anything.
Okay, very clear. Bill Binney.
Yeah. As far as the role of intel in media, I would simply say go back to Director of the CIA Gates when he was said in, I think it was 1983. He said we have started to infiltrate the media, and you'll know we've succeeded in doing that once everything that's believed by the public in the United States is false. And I would also point out, if you simply look at the people who came from Intel, like Clapper and Brennan and so on, who are now populating the commenters on the media. So it's the mainstream media that's picking these people up. So what that really tells me is what they were the whole objective of infiltrating the media and getting them to say what they want, but what the people in the bureaucrats and government want, they've succeeded. They've done. We've had it. We are in that state now.
Okay. All right. Very good. Colonel Black?
Yes. You had two questions. Let me start with the first. Your listener was surprised that Article 88 applied to retired officers. Every officer, when he does out process to retire, is informed about the meaning and effect of Article 88. Now, there's nothing that prevents a retired officer from getting together with a group of friends and saying, "Oh, I think such and such is just the worst thing in the world. Personally, I think he's a dog." You can do that. The problem is when you publicly use contemptuous words towards the president. You can criticize policies. You can be very harsh. You can say, "I really oppose this particular policy or this action." It's when you use contemptuous words against the president. If you say, "He's a jerk," that's a contemptuous word. And so you have some gray areas, but I think it's pretty clear that some of these officers have gone over the board. The reason that it's so important for retired officers is that you take these retired 3- and 4-star officers, they really remain an integral part of the military establishment for many years after their retirement. So that's the story on Article 88. The other question was, how does the Insurrection Act define domestic terrorism? I'm not aware of the term domestic terrorism being actually used in the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is a broad grant of authority from Congress to the president to recognize his ability to put down insurrections, uprisings, and that sort of thing. Typically, it's triggered by a request from the governor of a state who says, "Hey, look, I got a problem." This happened in 1992 in California with the LA riots, which had gone on for a long time, tremendous bloodshed and destruction. The governor requested and then the president activated and sent the troops in. But I don't know that the term domestic terrorism, I could be wrong, there may have been an amendment I'm not aware of, but I don't think that that term is actually used in the Insurrection Act.
Okay, thank you. And I think I've covered everybody, except if my co-moderator has anything she'd like to say at this point.
No, that's fine.
Okay, so Helga, this is pretty much, I think, our final statement. So you've got your questions there, and then you're going to be doing our summary statement, and then we're out of here. So go right ahead.
Well, concerning the sanction question, I think that, there are certain things which should really be outlawed under conditions of a pandemic. One of them is sanctions, because it is very clear that it deprives the country which is being hit with those of taking care of the urgent medical questions, to protect the population. I mean, sanctions should just stop while the pandemic is going as a principle. And those who are imposing it, like the U.S. Congress, which is quite, expensive with it, they should just also know that, all this discussion about human rights and democracy is becoming quite hollow around the world. And people recognize that there is a double standard of those who are using it. Otherwise, I think that, what I said earlier in my remarks, that the crisis we face is so fundamentally, all-inclusive, that I think that the principle of the coincidence of opposites, what Nicolaus of Cusa developed in the 15th century as a new method of thinking that the one is of a higher quality than the many, and that you have to think about the interest of mankind first before you think about any particular problem, and that you cannot hope to solve all these different problems at the same time, because we are in a systemic collapse. We are seeing the end of an epoch, and therefore you have to design some completely new paradigm. And then, the question, if the relations among the major powers, US, Russia, China, and others, if that is being put on a really human basis, then, such questions as sanctions are like the derivative which will disappear. So I can only reiterate that, if you want to solve any particular problem, help to solve the big one, because if we do not move humanity as a whole into a new paradigm, I'm afraid that all of those problems which were discussed today may actually, spin out of control, and we end up in a complete chaos of civilization.
All right, I want to thank everybody on the panel for being with us today. Helga Sepp-LaRouche, Andrei Kortunov, Dr. Edward Lazansky, Martin Sieff, James Jatras, Marco Zanni, Colonel Richard Black, Bill Binney, and Kirk Wiebe. I see somebody raising their hand. Oh, is that Helga? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought I had a concluding statement after that. Can I do that now?
Go ahead, do it now.
Yeah, because answering the question from Virginia about, how can we get people to look to the stars and elevate themselves above this present degraded culture. And I think this is really the most important question of all, because it is my absolute conviction that all policies, no matter what they are, flow out of the image of man which the people have. If you have a degraded image of man, or you think, that only some people are belonging to an elite and others are like cattle who can be diminished, like the helots in Sparta or the slaves in Rome, then that image of man dictates every aspect of your policy. So therefore, I think that we absolutely need, in combination with this P5 or four major power summit, no matter which, but we need a summit. What has to be included absolutely is a renaissance of classical culture. this is very important because if you, and I mentioned this already, but I know a lot of Afro-Americans think that she is a great star, this Cardi B. But for me, this is the absolute incarnation of slavery, of accepting a degraded state of mind. And, what we need instead is, and I know people are very peculiar about their taste of music, but we are in the year of Beethoven. And if you compare that kind of music with the absolute elevating, ennobling spirit of Beethoven and many other classical composers, it should be so obvious that if mankind does not elevate itself now out of this present condition by going back to the greatest traditions of each culture, I don't think we will make it. On the other side, this great culture is absolutely available. And, we will hear tomorrow a beautiful performance of that music. And I would like people to reflect, that I absolutely think that we will not solve this problem if we don't change the way how people think. And I agree with Friedrich Schiller, and that's why the Schiller Institute is named after him, that it does require great classical art to affect the aesthetical education, the moral ennoblement of people. And I can tell you, if you look at the present contemporary people, if we do not improve them morally, I don't think we have a chance better than a snowflake in hell to come out of this crisis. So the question of a cultural renaissance is sort of the absolute precondition to solve all of these crises.
Okay, so we have now concluded. I'd like to just say something to everybody who's watching, both internationally and nationally here in the United States. You see what we've just put together. I think people, after you get a chance to think about what you've actually just heard today, recognize that this is a highly unusual gathering. Matter of fact, I'm not sure that anyone else in the world is doing anything like this at the moment. This symposium and the ones that will be happening both this afternoon and then 2 tomorrow are the product of the Schiller Institute as an organization, as an association. The concept is, and it's already been said here, a coincidence of opposites, bringing together people and having a symposium, being able to actually talk and discuss great ideas or important crises from the standpoint of the depth of history and also from the standpoint of the depth of experience, both of the participants, but also by those people who are also questioning, bringing in questions during the actual discussion. This is intended to provoke something which we want you to help us do during the day today and tomorrow. You should join the Schiller Institute. There's a sustaining membership that you can get. We of course need and appreciate money and contributions, things like that. We're absolutely, that's actually a very important element of what we're doing. But more importantly, in terms of today, in terms of now, get out the word about what it is you're hearing, you heard here today, and have people tune into the conference, which will continue. Our second panel is actually going to begin in about an hour. That panel is called The Role of Science in Creating Mankind's Future. So it'll be starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and then tomorrow on Sunday, we have 2 panels. Panel 3, the conference, The Belt and Road Initiative Becomes the World Land Bridge, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Unfinished Business. That will happen 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. And then panel 4, Building Trust in International Relations, the Role of Classical Culture, and Combining and Combating World Famine. So that's the title for that one. That's panel 4. That's at 3 p.m. tomorrow. So 2 panels tomorrow and 1 panel this afternoon. So we thank you, and we'll see you in about an hour.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to start because you are in for a fabulous evening and an action-packed and knowledge-packed evening. My name's Jenny McGregor and I'm CEO of AsiaLink at the University of Melbourne, and I've actually had the enormous privilege over the last 2 days of taking Martin to Sydney, where he spoke yesterday at lunchtime. He then flew to Canberra, where he spoke to our Leaders Program. He then came to Melbourne, where he spoke at lunchtime, and now he has we have the honour of this fabulous audience at the University of Melbourne. And I'm going to just do a pretty quick spruik for the book, because I have had a fabulous time getting into this book. It came out first in 2009, Martin, and for the last 20 months or so, Martin has been knee-deep and in all of the data to update this copy, and it is an awesome resource. It's I won't tell you about it because he will, but I do urge you to get a copy, and he will be signing at the end of the evening. It's an exceptional book. We have not seen the like of it in this country, and I just wish that we could have taken Martin to every state. But you can get him on YouTube too. I think you need to update your YouTube probably too, Martin, don't you? Your YouTube is still out there happening. Your YouTube address, yeah. So, yes, your TED Talk on YouTube. So, also a great resource for you. But my job tonight is actually to introduce our host for the evening, Oscar Savakty. And many of you will know Oscar. He's an award-winning multi-platform journalist with the ABC. He's a reporter and anchor for the daily news for the ABC's international service, Australian Network, broadcasting to over 40 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Before joining the ABC, Oscar was a journalist for SBS, working across the network's TV and radio news and current affairs. And his stories have also featured on CNN. But this is my favourite piece about Oscar. He's met and interviewed the Pope, raising the issue of sex abuse with him. He's twice had a private audience with the Dalai Lama, and he's met royalty from India, Britain and Spain. So you're in good hands tonight, Martin. I don't think he'll ask you about sex abuse, but he does promise us to be controversial. So you're going to have a harder time tonight, perhaps, than you've had in the other audiences. So please welcome everybody, our host tonight, Oscar Savakty.
Thank you, Jenny, for that introduction. And my aim isn't to be needlessly hard. I just want to ask interesting questions. But of course, this event is about the audience, and hopefully we'll have enough time to entertain your questions. Before I introduce Martin, I'd just like to mention our Twitter hashtag. We're encouraging all of you in the audience to firstly put your phones on silent, of course, but also feel free to tweet as the night goes along. The hashtag is China Rules. And also, just to give you a bit about the format of tonight, Martin's going to be giving us a presentation that he's prepared, after which we'll open it up to questions. Okay, I'm sure Martin needs no introduction, but I've got one here anyway. Martin Jakes is the author of the global bestseller, When China Rules the World, The End of the Western World and the Birth of a New Global Order. His TED Talk on how to understand China has had almost 1 million views. He is a senior visiting research fellow at IDEAS, a centre for